Welcome to In Focus. I'm Pater Laffin, editor of the Washington Examiner's In Focus section. Our guest today is Professor Lawrence Krauss. Professor Krauss is a world-renowned theoretical physicist and editor of the new book, The War on Science, a collection of essays that exposes the threat to science posed by left-wing activists. Professor Krauss, we're so happy we could have you today, and welcome to the show.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you after you've written such a nice piece and about the book, and I'm happy to talk to you live. And by the way, I'd be negligent if I didn't hold up the book. So there it is. Anyway, let's
I'm,
talk.
I'm glad you did. I have my copy, but I lost the jacket, so I couldn't hold it up.
Oh, well, yeah, the jacket tends to fall off. I agree, but anyway, yeah.
Like so many conservatives, I discovered you on YouTube about 20 years ago, arguing
Oh,
with Christians, arguing with Christians about the existence of God, teaching evolution in schools. And I was going through a conversion process at the time. I was an atheist and I was becoming a Catholic, but I was intensely interested in what you had to say about all of this because you spoke with this great conviction and clarity, and you raised some really important things that I needed to understand. When we fast forward a quarter century, I see that same conviction and clarity in your speech when you're arguing now with people on the left, which seems a little surreal. So I'm wondering if is that how you see it? Is it essentially the same argument but with different people?
It's the same argument. It's just arguing against secular religion instead of regular religion. I think, the world is a better place if you base your attitudes and particularly political policies on evidence and reasoning and have open debate and questioning. And that's always been my problem with religion. My problem is always assuming the answers before you ask the questions. And and religion, in my opinion, that's the heart of religion. And not only assuming the answers, but in fact not being allowed to ask the questions, at least in certain fundamentalist versions of religion. And that's
That's what
exactly
I would say. There's a difference between fundamentalist religion and
yeah,
religion.
yeah, yeah, fundamentalists, The other stuff is just well-meaning, although misplaced. But anyway, um, but it's exactly the same here, where not only are you assuming the answers before you ask the questions, but you're not allowed to ask the questions. And what's particularly concerning is if you're someone like me, you maybe incorrectly assume that I would expect not to be allowed to ask the questions in some religious forum in certain religious forms, and I know enough to know the difference between fundamentalist religion and other religion. But the one place where I certainly would never expect to be in a situation where you can't ask the questions is academia, because that's the whole point of academia. As I've written for years, the purpose of education is to make you uncomfortable, in my opinion, because if you're comfortable, you're never really pushing the edge of the envelope. I tell people, that's why one of the reasons why I think public school is good, mostly to get kids out of their house and learn that their parents are wrong, or don't and not really wrong, but not always right, or at least to hear other views. And so, when education and academia and scholarship and research is getting to the point where certain questions cannot be asked, and that's just one aspect of what we talk about in the book. That's of real concern because that stifles progress, academic progress, scientific progress in particular. Science is based on open questioning and empirical evidence, but retesting and open debate. It's science is a social activity, as is all scholarship to some extent, but science in particular. While people don't envisage it as that, they think of it Einstein in a room, in the middle of the night writing something, but that's just not the way science is done. Science is done by interactions and open questioning and attack on your ideas, and only the good ideas survive. And and when I saw that the situation changing, it was a great concern. And now it's become a more concern in so many different ways. But the fact that not only that you can't question, but that people can be canceled for questioning, that that the notion that offense is the same as that that people who are offended have
Mm,
special rights, which they don't have and shouldn't have, is of
right.
great concern. And the infiltration of political ideology in particular into the educational system. Now, it's true that you say it's from the left, and it is for the most part now from the left. It's been other times from the right. rather, as we may have talked about when we talked last, there's an external attack on science that's happening now, and that's coming from the right.
Sure.
That
So,
I
so
partly in
yeah,
response to this, in the fact that what people are seeing, this quote unquote wokeness, has convinced certain people that all of education and all of
right.
science is somehow corrupted, and therefore they have to get rid of the whole kit and caboodle. Where in fact it's not that way at all. Harvard
Yeah,
has problems with not just anti-Semitism and wokeness, but discrimination against Asians, Asians for admissions and all the rest. But Harvard is still one of the great educational institutions in the world, and great science
right,
is being done there. And if you decide to throw the baby out with the bathwater, you're hurting the whole American
right.
uh, enterprise. But in any case, that's an external attack which we can fight at
Sure.
the ballot box. The internal culture war is harder to fight because it's becoming so ingrained. And that's why we wrote, why we did this book, or at least why I wanted to do a book with a lot of people to show
Hmm.
that this is a serious problem, not just one I'm concerned about, but many academics. And the only way to attack is for academics to speak out. Anyway, that's a long answer.
So I think our audience is pretty familiar with when things started to go south in academia. We know that the George Floyd killing really accelerated, and you go into that in the book. But maybe you could put some meat on the bone for us. How exactly do these left-wing activists interfere with science in a tangible sense? We know they're annoying. We know that they are very loud. But how do they interfere with you and your fellow scientists actually practicing science?
Well, I mean, the point is the activists always do activism, and one has to be wary of them in every what case. And sometimes it's important to be an activist. But when they where they interfere is when they become part of the establishment. And in particular, when scientific leaders or university leaders feel that they have to respond to those activist social media mobs by going out in front of them and not only just virtue signaling, but creating policies that then hurt science. And I mean, there's so many examples of that. I give one. I mean, I'll give one for or two from physics, my own field. Um, this is remarkable to me. It's still remarkable to me that this could even happen. That the American Physical Society, which is the major association of physicists around the world, actually. Um, Even in 2020, speaking of George Floyd, so after George Floyd, in December 2020, the American Physical Society sent out a letter to the entire membership saying that a presidential order from during the first Trump administration, on combating race and sex stereotyping was, quote, in direct opposition to the core values of the American Physical Society, and it needed to be rescinded in order to strengthen America's scientific enterprise. That's what's really kind of interesting. What did the executive order say? It quoted Martin Luther King, stating that government supported scientific institutions should not, in those institutions, people should not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. That's
That's what
somehow
was so offensive.
yeah, and that's
Wow.
somehow antithetical to the core values of the American Physical Society because because it become identity politics. That the idea that colorblind, as they say, that colorblindness and meritocracy were equivalent to actions of bias, or that rationality over emotionality is a white example of white male supremacy, and that those kind of ridiculous postmodernist notions are ridiculous. But when they become ingrained institutionally, then you have a problem because because then you get rid of merit in institutions, and you have to have these loyalty oaths for people, to be anti-racism, which is basically racism. And then when you get the notion that somehow, I mean, all of this is based on the postmodernist idea that, which is somewhat Marxist, that all knowledge is subjective and it's all based on systems of power and oppression. And there's power centers and there's oppressed, and knowledge is always determined by the people who are in power and it's not objective. All of that kind of dialectic, that Marxist dialectic, which is a characteristic of postmodernism,
Mhm.
is extremely problematic when it then governs the way these institutions run. And perhaps the most egregious example of it now for me is in scientific journals,
Mhm.
which which should of course be the place where you should see the kind of standards of science being upheld the most because that's where
Right.
science results are published. When the Royal Society of Chemistry set out a new series of guidelines and I'll read this. It's been produced by this is to their editors to help minimize the risk of publishing inappropriate, quote, inappropriate or otherwise offensive content. They said offense is a subjective matter and sensitivity to it spans a considerable range. However, we bear in mind, and this is, I mean, that's true. We bear in mind that it's the perception of the recipient we should consider,
Wow.
regardless of the author's intention. Please consider whether any content that's words, depictions, or imagery, just might have the potential to cause offense, and then don't publish it. And they say, okay, what are they talking about offense? Maybe they're being specific. And they say, here's what offense comprises. Any offensive content is any content that could reasonably offend someone on the basis of their age, gender, race, sexual orientation, religious or political identity, marital or parental status, physical features, national origin, or social status, or disability. It's pretty
So
hard.
in other words, shut up.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't do anything.
You can't find someone who's offended by anything you say in terms. I can guarantee you from having been a public voice for 20 or 30 years that anything I say will offend someone. And in some ways, I kind of hope it does because that gets people to think at least. I don't go out of my way to offend, in spite of what some people think. But it's worse.
I think you relish transgression a little. I think that's fair to
I
say.
relish provocation because I think it's a way to to get discussion going and to get people to question their own beliefs. I think the only way you can learn is to question your own biases. And I'm not saying you're wrong, but if I can at least get you to question them,
Right.
maybe you're right, and you'll convince me. That's as has happened every now and then. I think there are at least one or two times in my life I've been wrong, and then but then it's worse.
I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah, that's right. I'm happy to admit it. One of the times I know I was wrong because I thought I was wrong. No, anyway, I'm just joking. But worse than that is Nature, which and Science magazine. These are two sort of the major, um, probably most prominent scientific journals. Nature has come out first, actually, with something I quote in the book, and second, something last week. Just to give you a sense that this isn't over yet. People say, "Oh, the peak is over," and it's not.
And
At
that
this
was my
point,
next question. So this is perfect.
yeah, okay, but so Nature Behavior produced an editorial called "Science Must Respect the Dignity and Rights of All Humans." They established a new editorial policy. The journal will reject articles. Get this. The journal will reject articles that might potentially harm, even inadvertently, those individuals or groups most vulnerable to racism, sexism, ableism, or homophobia. In short, therefore, if the results of a scientific investigation are true, but someone might be offended, they won't be published. Now that is
Well,
that is just that's unfathomable. Okay,
right.
and then they topped it off, the icing on the cake this week. Nature came out again with an editorial about citation diversity. So
Wow.
citations are where you write articles and you try and show where the intellectual how you came up with those ideas and the evidence that gave you evidence for your scientific results and that help produce what you're doing. It's an essential part of any scientific publication. But now it's not just citing those ideas or experiments, but you have to decide, oh, well, that experiment's been done by white men. I better not cite that. I better look for something. It's just ridiculous to look for citation diversity. You cite those things that have had an impact or support or potentially critique ideas.
Right.
You don't determine on the basis of the color or race or sex or whatever of people. And so this when that's happening, you really have to worry about scientific progress. Anyway,
Well,
I'll
it
stop
seems
there.
like people who just fundamentally don't believe in objective truth to begin with, and that's kind of
And
the
that's right.
postmodern thing.
And so you probably know this already, or maybe you're the editor, so I shouldn't say it, but editors are generally the problem. And scientific editors have always been a problem. They're always
Mhm.
the gatekeepers. And I've published in Nature, but I've had incredible, ridiculous editors who hold things back. And they're famous examples of Nobel Prize winning papers that where the editor said, "Oh, I don't think this is important." But these editors are worse because somehow these journals are hiring editors who have bought into this kind of, who are not scientists clearly, and have bought into this thinking that somehow offense gives you special rights, and that there is systemic racism or sexism in science, something again for which there's no evidence.
Right.
But
So
if you believe there is, you at least have to provide the
right.
evidence.
Who are these people who are who are the people getting offended by science? Are there people who just sit around all day and read science journals and look
Well,
for things to be offended by?
unfortunately, what you're seeing is a group of young people who, for whatever reason, think that social justice, who become social justice activists, and and feel, for one reason or another, often that they're not. I can't help but say I think a fair fraction of this comes from disgruntled people who feel that they're not achieving what they should achieve in science and find a good reason other than the quality of their own work.
Got it.
I'll say that. But there are other people who have but beyond that, there are well-meaning people who have become so brainwashed by the idea that there is, and have heard forever that there is systemic racism or sexism, and therefore, feel, as happened a lot, and especially after George Floyd, that anti-racism is essential, which is essentially racism. Anti-racism is racism, because it's basically saying that it always reminded me of the burning of witches
Mm.
in the Middle Ages, where if you say you're not racist, then you must be racist. But if you say
Oh
you're
yeah.
racist,
If you say you're not racist, your privilege is off the
yeah,
charts.
but that's what's great. It's just like being rich. If you say you're not racist, you're racist. But if you say you are racist, you're also racist. It's like, remember in the Inquisition, they would, one of the things they do is they throw witches into a well or something, claimed witches, and if they floated and survived, they were witches, and then they'd be burned.
Right.
If they drowned, then and so it was a no-win situation. But I think you have a generation of people, or not some people, who feel earnestly that the system is broken and needs to be fixed, and they're so influenced by ideology and propaganda that they're not thinking clearly about it. I mean, and you see it. I begin the book, as you know, talking about my experience back when I taught at Yale, and how we used to laugh at the postmodernists, the deconstructionists down in the English department down the hill, and how Alan Sokal, who has a piece
Right.
in the New Volume, produces a famous spoof paper, claiming that quantum gravity.
Tell us about that. It's a great story.
Yeah, it's a great story, and I guess the young people don't know about it. He was a mathematical physicist. He published his paper called in the social science journal Social Text. The paper is entitled "Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity." Okay, which already should begin to worry. So somehow he's arguing quantum gravity. But here's what he said, and at the time it seemed ridiculous, but now, well, just listen to the words. Most recently, feminist and post-structuralist critiques have demystified the substantive of mainstream Western scientific practice, revealing the ideology of domination concealed behind the facade of objectivity. All reality, no less than social reality, is at bottom a social and linguistic construct. The scientific community cannot assert a privileged epistemological status with respect to counter hegemonic narratives emanating from dissident or marginalized communities. Just word salad that at the time was gobbledygook that he threw in, and then later on he announced that it was a spoof. Obviously, quantum gravity didn't really mean any of that, and of course, it was on the front page of the New York Times and everything else.
Right.
But 30 years later, the Journal of Chemical Education has published a special topics class of chemistry on feminism and science as a tool to disrupt the disconscious racism in STEM. I'll read it. I'll read the piece from the abstract. This article presents an argument on the importance of teaching science from a feminist framework and defines it by acknowledging that all knowledge is historically situated and is influenced by social power and politics. This is my favorite part. The course will explore the development and interrelationship between quantum mechanics, Marxist materialism, Afrofuturism, and pessimism, and post-colonial nationalism. I mean, so you couldn't make this stuff up, and there's a lot more like that, and so that that satirical imagery has become it's a reality. Now, let me point out, just to make it once clear, this is not all of science or all of research. I mean, there's important scientific research going on, and most academics, I would say, most scientists, I think it's fair to say, most scientists don't buy into this crap. But most academics try and keep their heads below the radar so they can just go ahead about their business. They don't want to get involved in the administration. They don't want to get involved in debates. They don't want to get involved in any of that. They just want to do their work. And they know the stuff that's going on, but they hope they can avoid it. And sure, maybe their graduate students have to produce these loyalty oath, these DEI statements in order to get jobs. But well, they can go to ChatGPT and get ChatGPT to write it, blah, blah, blah. But they do this clearly at their peril because now there's been a backlash. And when they ignore it, these bureaucracies, these diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracies, which again have co-opted terms which sound reasonable. Once again, it's good intentions, right? Who could it be against diversity or equity and inclusion?
Right.
They all sound like good words, except these groups it means exactly the opposite. Equity means equal outcomes, not equal opportunities. Inclusion means exclusion, means keeping out certain groups, and diversity means, once again, requiring non-diversity in hiring, in a sense. So these things, which sounded good, by faculty ignoring them, these bureaucracies have become more and more powerful. They answer to no one at universities. Everyone's terrified of them, and it's allowed these bureaucracies to govern things, and that's why it seems like academia is broken. I have some colleagues who really think it is, but I know enough physicists who are just going about their business that it isn't broken, but it is being constrained. And the fact that you cannot hire based on merit is hurting science. And and again, in my own country now, I live in Canada, it's legal to discriminate. The major government-funded endowed chairs in this country now are not open to white males. Literally, explicitly. The ad will say only those who identify as female or two-spirit or transgender can apply, and and that is definitely hurting science because once you academia in general is not supposed to be a democracy. It's supposed to be a meritocracy. Never was, never. And if you get rid of that, you're again hurting the future because the future of our society depends on healthy science. And if we restrict what can be studied, and we can restrict who can study it, then we're hurting progress. And one of the articles by Neil Ferguson here does point out this has happened. It happened in Nazi Germany very, very effectively, where the best universities in the world in 1930 in Berlin and Heidelberg became outposts because in that case Nazi ideology, where the Jewish faculty were restricted, and most of them and the United States benefited by getting physics, all the good ones.
And more than any, when you restrict who can get a job, you shrink the pool significantly.
Yes, and let me make it clear, you not only do, but some people claim, well, the pool has already been restricted, and it damn well isn't. That's the point. They say women can't, or minorities can't get a job, but in fact, it's the exact opposite. I was chairman of a physics department 30 years ago, and even then, if we hired someone who wasn't a woman, we had to write a special report to the administration explaining why we didn't do that. And I was proud that I hired the first two female faculty members in my department. But it's not as if the system is stacked against them. It's quite the opposite. And it's scary when people say, well, we have to open it up because we are right now restricting who can become in. And the point is two things. First of all, recognize that it's a complete lie, that academia is dominated by women right now. For every level, from undergraduates to full professors, 60% to 40% of undergraduates are female to male. And in STEM disciplines, if you go across all disciplines, females are the majority. So this notion that they're somehow excluded is nonsense. But worse than that, there are impediments, and to some extent they're systemic in our society that, I taught when I was chairman of the physics department, I was in Cleveland. I'd go into the inner city schools and I'd see there's no textbooks, and these kids have a leg down and have to overcome incredible issues to get up. So if you want to solve the problems, go and do that. You
Sure.
know, but not at the level of a full professor or people who've already benefited from all of the aspects of education and they're now in no way marginalized. In no way are you
Right.
people who are hired are not whether they're black or whether they're females. They've already succeeded in the system in order to even
Yeah.
get into that pool. So it's
Oh,
not
yeah.
to address these issues.
That word marginalized has lost all meaning. And
Absolutely.
that's a really important point. So how is the book being received? Have there been any fresh cancellations we need to know about?
Well, yes. There were, yeah, I mean, the book has been received by, as you might imagine, and it's interesting to see the reception in the United States versus even Canada or England. Um, Immediately, of course, on Amazon, there were a whole bunch of people within the first day who obviously hadn't even been able to read the book, who trashed it as right-wing fascist racism. So if you
You're a
look
right wing pundit now, I've read.
yeah, and I'm now a right-wing pundit. But worse than that, I mean, literally, if you look at the reviews, they say this is garbage, this is racism, these are right-wing, and this is like Steve Pinker and me and Richard Dawkins. All these people are known in the past as kind of left-wing, and there are right-wing people. I purposely chose a broad
Mhm.
intellectual background, so it couldn't be so anyone reasonable couldn't say this is a right-wing book. So it has been trashed online, on blogs. There was a hit piece in New York Magazine, a ridiculously stupid hit piece magazine, which basically attacked people by character assassination instead of the content. And the only two examples of the content were wrong. And even the authors, we got them to write the editors of New York Magazine. We didn't. They chose to, and get them to agree that what the two examples were completely wrong. I don't know if this person even read the book. And so you'd think that they just get rid of the article, but of course all they did was just at the editorial thing at the end, they didn't get rid of the article. So there were hit pieces. Um, there have been the American Physical Society, I will say, has already um, responded, and we'll see what happens with
Okay.
to try and cancel some things, and but and it's raised. There are people whose profiles have been raised as a result of this, and I'm happy to see in England, Alice Sullivan and John Armstrong are now. There have been issues that she talks about gender. Um, there's no one, as far as I know, that's written for this that has been no one. I mean, it's just been further character assassinations on the people who write it. As I say, people like Steven Pinker or whatever, you read the online things now call him basically, a co-opted right-wing person. And also what
Mhm.
uses me, you'll be pleased by this as a former atheist, that they're also it's the atheists are now the problem. They were
Yes.
the true atheists have now all become right-wing fascists. And yeah, anyway.
It's one of the most remarkable developments I've ever seen. How the new atheists fell out of favor. You guys were the poster boys for liberalism generally.
Yeah, but it was emerging early in I don't want to go into this. I don't like movements in general. I tried not to be a member. They used to say, are you part of the new atheist movement? Or I didn't know what new atheist was. I thought atheism has been around for a long time. I don't know what new was. But, we were called militant atheists. I used to laugh with Richard. What is a militant atheist? Where can we throw pamphlets at people or something? Anyway, but, um, but there was already the kind of internecine warfare in that quote unquote movement happening a long time ago. Once again, because it was dominated by white males. I mean, the ones who are most famous are me and Richard Dawkins and he's a standard group of four, Sam Harris and Dennett and other people um Chris
Hitchens.
Hitchens, obviously my late lovely wonderful friend Christopher Hitchens and Stephen Fry and there
Mhm.
were people within that who were saying, well, it's obviously sexist because it's white male, not already. I was being there were attacks on us in as early as 2014, 2013, 2012, emerging, and
Yeah.
it, even at the time reminded me very much of one of my favorite movies, um, Life of Brian. Um,
Right.
Remember Life
One
of
of my
Brian?
favorites too, I want to say. Yeah.
And I got to know Eric Idle afterwards, and I stole his song a lot. Anyway, he didn't mind. But I hope. Maybe did mind a little bit. But there's that great scene in that not in that forum in that amphitheater where they're talking at night and they meet and they say and they're talking about their conspiracy and they're the Liberation Front for Palestine or whatever. And don't talk to that guy either. He's for the front for the liberation of Palestine. And it's like, it's something all the people they're all the bad guys are the
It's the
competing
Popular
group.
Front.
Yeah, the Popular Front. Yeah, I mean, it's just anyway, and it reminded me at the time of exactly that, and I began to see it at the time. So I think all that tends to happen within these movements because people like ideology, and
Mhm.
I think it's important. That's why I remember Richard Dawkins and I when we, and I think you see it in the movie The Unbelievers about us. I don't remember.
Mhm.
We did a big event at the Sydney Opera House, which I'm happy to say was sold out. I did two sold out events, but anyway, it doesn't matter. Where I think someone says, how do you work to have people follow you? And Richard, to his credit, said what we both agree. We don't want anyone to follow us. We just want people to think. I don't,
Right.
and that's the key point. But somehow, when you have movement, you've got to follow it. And if you ask people of almost any movement, and I don't want to just label the atheists here. I think it's true of almost every
Mhm.
ideological movement, political movement, why they believe what they believe or why they're lobbying for their lobbying. They're often come up empty.
Right.
I love seeing when people are interviewed. They interview those students at Columbia who are, at the time of all the protests against Israel, kill the Jews. Why they were. Do they know anything about where Gaza is or what from the river to the sea means or any of that stuff? They didn't have the slightest idea. Did they, Queers for Palestine, did they know, did they really understand what would happen if they went to Palestine right now or not Palestine, because they're in Palestine, to Gaza to try and they'd be dead in a minute. And these kids had no ideas because, well, certainly love people, young people, and I admire this. Young people like
I admire it too. Yeah.
and I was, I remember Vietnam, and it was the young people who played a huge role. In that
Mhm.
case, I think on the right side of history, of
Yeah.
trying to argue that was an inappropriate conflict.
Yeah.
So young
For
people,
my generation, that was Iraq.
what was that?
And for my generation, that was Iraq.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. And so I think it's really important that young people be prepared to protest. But once again, protesting and arguing for people to be killed are two different things. And
So,
Steve Pinker, I think Steve, there's other people, but he he poked fun at it. He satirized it most effectively when he pointed out at Harvard, and I think I'd said this, but he said it effectively in print that, these kids who go from their classes in microaggression, learning how not to
mhm.
misgender people, and that's a form of violence, say, oh, I have to leave early because I have to go to the Kill All the Jews rally. Anyway, anyway.
So last question. I'm sure everybody is curious about this in our audience. So you've been rubbing elbows, linking arms with conservatives now for the past few years, really in the past year, maybe a bit more explicitly. Has it rubbed off on you at all? Whether that's conservative politics or religious belief, have you seen your worldview shift at all through this experience?
Well, every time my worldview shifts all the time. I like to think that's part of being a scientist, or at least being somewhat like to think of as a scholar in some ways. I'm prepared to change my mind. And yeah, of course it has. And I don't know if that's the property of age. I have come to appreciate, um, certainly when it comes to arguments um, of free speech, and to some extent libertarianism. Um, I'm more I'm more open to some of that than I certainly was before. When it comes to religious belief, no, that hasn't
Okay.
changed. I still think religion on the whole is a negative force in the world. But what I will say to its credit, and I've said this in public, is that the difference between, say, Christian religion and secular religion that we're seeing now is that at least Christianity allows the possibility of absolution. And you don't see that in the secular religion. There's no absolution. There's no forgiveness. There's no
Mm.
and that's a pity. So I'll give religion at least that, or at least
Well,
certain religions at least that.
Lawrence, I appreciate that very much. That's really insightful, and I appreciate your time on this show today. And please keep us updated how the book is going. Our audience is very interested in good science being practiced. So check back in with us soon.
Sure, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, as it was the last time we talked, and I really appreciate you doing this. So, yeah, we'll keep up the good fight, and hopefully, in many ways, on the same side.
You bet. All right,
Okay,
Lawrence Krauss, thanks so much.
thank you.